For generations, Canada's economic playbook was surprisingly simple: build with America, trade with America, sell to America, and when things got complicated, work even more closely with America. It wasn't just a policy. It was practically geography. Nearly 80% of Canada's exports flowed south. Factories on both sides of the border became connected. Supply chains crossed back and forth so many times that sometimes a single product would cross the border multiple times before reaching a customer. The relationship became so integrated that many people stopped questioning it altogether. But now Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is saying something that would have sounded almost unthinkable just a few years ago. According to Carney, Canada needs to become less dependent on the United States, not because America is an enemy, not because Canada wants to walk away, but because, in his view, becoming less dependent could actually make Canada a stronger ally.
We're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along.
And that raises an obvious question. How does moving away from your closest partner make the relationship better? Because at first glance, it sounds backwards. If two countries want a stronger relationship, shouldn't they become more connected, not less? Well, that's exactly why Carney's comments are generating so much attention. Because beneath that seemingly simple statement is a much bigger story about trade, leverage, power, and how countries are adapting to a world that suddenly feels a lot less predictable than it did a decade ago. And to understand why this matters, we need to start with something most people rarely think about: dependence, not partnership, dependence. Because those two words sound similar, but they are not the same thing. For decades, Canada benefited enormously from its relationship with the United States. The American market is massive, it's close, it's familiar, and for Canadian businesses, it often made more sense to sell to customers a few hundred miles south than to customers thousands of miles away across oceans. The arrangement worked for generations. In many ways, it worked so well that Canada became one of the most trade-dependent advanced economies in the world. But here's where the story starts getting interesting. The benefits of dependence are easy to see when everything is stable. The risks usually remain invisible until something changes. And over the last several years, a lot has changed. Think about how often trade has become political. Think about tariffs. Think about disputes involving lumber. Think about steel. Think about aluminum. Think about energy. Think about defense spending. Think about border issues. Think about CUSMA negotiations. One disagreement after another. One surprise after another. And each time a new dispute emerged, Canada was reminded of something uncomfortable. When most of your economic activity depends on one partner, that partner has enormous influence over your future. Now, to be fair, this isn't unique to Canada. Countries around the world are asking similar questions. Germany has been rethinking dependencies. Japan has been rethinking dependencies. Australia has been rethinking dependencies. Even the United States itself has spent years talking about reducing strategic vulnerabilities. But Canada's situation is particularly interesting because of the sheer scale of its relationship with America. There is simply no other country in the world that occupies the same role in Canada's economy. And that brings us back to Carney, because when he talks about reducing dependence, he's not talking about ending the relationship. He's talking about changing the balance of the relationship. And that's a very different thing. Think about it this way. Imagine a company that gets 80% of its revenue from a single customer. Even if that customer is wonderful, the company still has a problem. Because if that customer changes their mind, changes their strategy, or simply decides to negotiate harder, the company suddenly finds itself in a vulnerable position. Now imagine that same company develops additional customers. The original customer is still important. The partnership remains valuable, but the balance changes. The company now has options, and options create leverage. That's the basic argument Carney appears to be making. Not separation, not confrontation, options. And once you start viewing the story through that lens, a lot of Canada's recent decisions begin making more sense. Because something interesting has been happening over the past year. While headlines often focused on trade disputes with Washington, Canada was quietly strengthening relationships elsewhere. Europe received more attention. Defense cooperation expanded, trade discussions intensified, investment conversations multiplied, and if you only looked at each development individually, it might not seem particularly significant. But when you zoom out, a pattern begins to emerge. Canada isn't abandoning America. Canada is building alternatives, and those are very different things. Now here's where things become even more fascinating, because many people assume diversification is primarily about economics, more markets, more customers, more trade routes. But increasingly, it looks like diversification is becoming a strategic issue as well, because uncertainty changes behavior, and uncertainty has become one of the defining themes of modern geopolitics. Companies are adapting, investors are adapting, governments are adapting. Everyone is asking the same question. What happens if the assumptions we've relied on for decades no longer hold? For years, countries built strategies around predictability. Supply chains stretched across continents, trade agreements expanded, economic integration accelerated. The assumption was simple: the system would remain relatively stable. But recent years have challenged that assumption. Pandemics disrupted supply chains. Wars disrupted markets. Political disagreements disrupted trade relationships. And suddenly, resilience became just as important as efficiency. That's a huge shift. Because for decades, efficiency was king. Now resilience is competing for the throne, and that's where Canada's conversation becomes part of a much larger global story. A story about countries trying to build flexibility in an increasingly uncertain world. But here's the part that many people miss. Diversification doesn't happen overnight. You can't simply wake up one morning and redirect decades of trade patterns. You can't instantly replace infrastructure. You can't immediately recreate supply chains that took generations to develop. And that's why some of the more dramatic interpretations of Carney's comments miss the point. This isn't about replacing America. That's not realistic. And it's not what Canada's leaders appear to be pursuing. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner. The economies remain deeply connected. The border remains one of the most important commercial corridors on Earth. None of that changes overnight. What changes is the strategy. The objective shifts from maximum integration to balanced integration.
We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. The multilateral institutions on which the middle powers have relied, the WTO, the UN, the COP, the architecture, the very architecture of collective problem solving are under threat. And as a result, many countries are drawing the same conclusions, that they must develop greater strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, in finance, and supply chains. And this impulse is understandable. A country that can't feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has few options. When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself.
And that distinction matters, because balanced relationships often prove more durable than dependent relationships. When both sides have options, negotiations look different, conversations look different, expectations look different, and perhaps most importantly, surprises become less disruptive. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets discussed openly: power. Not military power, not political power, economic power. Because dependence and power are closely connected. The more alternatives you have, the more flexibility you possess. The fewer alternatives you have, the more vulnerable you become. That's true for individuals, it's true for companies, and it's true for countries. For a long time, Canada's relationship with America delivered so many benefits that discussions about vulnerability remained largely theoretical. But recent disputes transformed those theoretical concerns into practical ones. Every tariff threat, every trade disagreement, every negotiation, every moment of uncertainty, all of them reinforced the same lesson. Options matter. And once a country starts thinking that way, diversification stops looking like a luxury. It starts looking like insurance. Now, some critics argue that this strategy carries risks of its own, and they're not wrong. Building new partnerships takes time. Developing new markets takes effort. Trade diversification can be expensive. Results don't always appear immediately. There are no guarantees, and that's important to acknowledge because not every diversification strategy succeeds. Not every new market delivers the expected results. Not every partnership becomes transformative. But supporters of the approach would respond with a simple question. What's the alternative? Continue increasing dependence indefinitely? Hope uncertainty disappears? Assume future disruptions won't happen? Those assumptions look a lot harder to defend today than they did 10 years ago. And perhaps that's why Carney's comments resonate beyond Canada. Because countries around the world are confronting similar dilemmas. How much dependence is too much? How much diversification is enough? How do you balance efficiency with resilience? How do you maintain strong partnerships while protecting yourself against future uncertainty? There aren't easy answers. But those questions are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And that's what makes this story so much bigger than a single speech or a single headline. At its core, this isn't really about Canada moving away from America. It's about redefining what partnership means in a changing world. For decades, closeness was often measured through dependence. The more connected two countries became, the stronger the relationship was assumed to be. Carney appears to be proposing something different. A relationship built not on dependence, but on choice. A relationship where cooperation exists because both sides want it, not because one side lacks alternatives. And whether you agree with that vision or not, it's a fascinating shift in perspective. Because it suggests that the future of alliances may look very different from the past. Not weaker, not necessarily stronger, just different, more flexible, more balanced, more resilient. And perhaps that's why this conversation matters. Because the real question isn't whether Canada and America will remain partners. They almost certainly will. The real question is what that partnership looks like when one side decides it never wants to be quite as dependent as it once was. And judging by the conversations now happening in Ottawa, Washington, Brussels, and capitals around the world, Canada may not be the only country asking that question anymore. The answer could shape trade, diplomacy, and economic strategy for years to come. And that's why a single comment from Mark Carney has sparked a much bigger debate than most people expected. Because sometimes the most important changes aren't about ending relationships, they're about redefining them.